I have been making inquiries in the neighbourhood in which his old master lived,' said the stranger, 'and I learn that he was served by this lad. I have found out his mother's house, and have been directed by her to this place as the nearest in which I should be likely to find him. That's the cause of my presenting myself here this morning.' 'I am very glad of any cause, sir,' said the notary, 'which procures me the honour of this visit.' 'Sir,' retorted the stranger, 'you speak like a mere man of the world, and I think you something better. Therefore, pray do not sink your real character in paying unmeaning compliments to me.' 'Ahem!' coughed the notary. 'You're a plain speaker, sir.' 'And a plain dealer,' returned the stranger. 'It may be my long absence and inexperience that lead me to the conclusion, but if plain speakers are scarce in this part of the world, I fancy plain dealers are still scarcer. If my speaking should offend you, sir, my dealing, I hope, will make amends.' Mr Witherden seemed a little disconcerted by the elderly gentleman's mode of conducting the dialogue, and as for Kit, he looked at him in open-mouthed astonishment, wondering what kind of language he would address to him if he talked in that free and easy way to a notary. It was with no harshness, however, though with something of constitutional irritability and haste, that he turned to Kit and said: 'If you think, my lad, that I am pursuing these inquiries with any other view than that of serving and reclaiming those I am in search of, you do me a very great wrong, and deceive yourself. Don't be deceived, I beg of you, but rely upon my assurance. The fact is, gentlemen,' he added, turning again to the notary and his pupil, 'that I am in a very painful and wholly unexpected position. I came to this city with a darling object at my heart, expecting to find no obstacle or difficulty in the way of its attainment. I find myself suddenly checked and stopped short in the execution of my design by a mystery which I cannot penetrate. Every effort I have made to penetrate it has only served to render it darker and more obscure, and I am afraid to stir openly in the matter, lest those whom I anxiously pursue should fly still farther from me. I assure you that if you could give me any assistance, you would not be sorry to do so, if you knew how greatly I stand in need of it, and what a load it would relieve me from.' There was a simplicity in this confidence which occasioned it to find a quick response in the breast of the good-natured notary, who replied in the same spirit that the stranger had not mistaken his desire, and that if he could be of service to him, he would, most readily. Kit was then put under examination, and closely questioned by the unknown gentleman, touching his old master and the child, their lonely way of life, their retired habits and strict seclusion, the nightly absence of the old man, the solitary existence of the child at those times, his illness and recovery, Quilp's possession of the house, and their sudden disappearance, were all the subjects of much questioning and answer. Finally, Kit informed the gentleman that the premises were now to let, and that a board upon the door referred all inquiries to Mr Sampson Brass, solicitor of Bevis Marks, from whom he might perhaps learn some further particulars. 'Not by inquiry,' said the gentleman, shaking his head. 'I live there.' 'Live at Brass's the attorney's?' cried Mr Witherden in some surprise, having professional knowledge of the gentleman in question. 'Ay,' was the reply. 'I entered on his lodgings t'other day, chiefly because I had seen this very board. It matters little to me where I live, and I had a desperate hope that some intelligence might be cast in my way there, which would not reach me elsewhere. Yes, I live at Brass's. More shame for me, I suppose.' 'That's a mere matter of opinion,' said the notary, shrugging his shoulders. 'He is looked upon as rather a doubtful character.' 'Doubtful?' echoed the other. 'I am glad to hear there's any doubt about it. I suppose that had been thoroughly settled long ago, but will you let me speak a word or two with you in private?' Mr Witherden consenting, they walked into that gentleman's private closet, and remained there, in close conversation, for some quarter of an hour, when they returned into the outer office. The stranger had left his hat in Mr Witherden's room, and seemed to have established himself in this short interval on quite a friendly footing. 'I'll not detain you any longer now,' he said, putting a crown into Kit's hand and looking towards the notary. 'You shall hear from me again. Not a word of this, you know, except to your master and mistress.'
'Mother, sir, would be glad to know,' said Kit, faltering.
'Glad to know what?'
'Anything, so that it was no harm about Miss Nell.'
'Would she? Well then, you may tell her, if she can keep a secret. But mind, not a word of this to anybody else. Don't forget that. Be particular.'
'I'll take care, sir,' said Kit. 'Thank'ee, sir, and good morning.'
Now it happened that the gentleman, in his anxiety to impress upon Kit that he was not to tell anybody what had passed between them, followed him out to the door to repeat his caution, and it further happened that at that moment the eyes of Mr Richard Swiveller were turned in that direction, and beheld his mysterious friend and Kit together. It was quite an accident, and the way in which it came about was this. Mr Chuckster, being a gentleman of a cultivated taste and refined spirit, was one of that lodge of glorious Apollos, whereof Mr Swiveller was perpetual grand. Mr Swiveller, passing through the street in the execution of some brazen errand, and beholding one of his glorious brotherhood, intently gazing on a pony, crossed over to give him that fraternal greeting with which perpetual grands are, by the very constitution of their office, bound to cheer and encourage their disciples. He had scarcely bestowed upon him his blessing, and followed it with a general remark touching the present state and prospects of the weather, when, lifting up his eyes, he beheld the single gentleman of Bevis Marks in earnest conversation with Christopher Nubbles. 'Hallo!' said Dick. 'Who's that?' 'He called to see my governor this morning,' replied Mr Chuckster. 'Beyond that, I don't know him from Adam.' 'At least you know his name?' said Dick. To which Mr Chuckster replied, with an elevation of speech becoming a glorious Apollo, that he was everlastingly blessed if he did. 'All I know, my dear feller,' said Mr Chuckster, running his fingers through his hair, 'is that he is the cause of my having stood here 20 minutes, for which I hate him with a mortal and undying hatred, and would pursue him to the confines of eternity if I could afford the time.' While they were thus discoursing, the subject of their conversation, who had not appeared to recognize Mr Richard Swiveller, re-entered the house, and Kit came down the steps and joined them, to whom Mr Swiveller again propounded his inquiry, with no better success.
'He's a very nice gentleman, sir,' said Kit, 'and that's all I know about him.' Mr Chuckster waxed wroth at this answer, and without applying the remark to any particular case, mentioned as a general truth that it was expedient to break the heads of snobs, and to tweak their noses. Without expressing his concurrence in this sentiment, Mr Swiveller, after a few moments of abstraction, inquired which way Kit was driving, and, being informed, declared it was his way, and that he would trespass on him for a lift. Kit would gladly have declined the proffered honour, but as Mr Swiveller was already established in the seat beside him, he had no means of doing so, otherwise than by a forcible ejectment, and therefore drove briskly off. So briskly, indeed, as to cut short the leave-taking between Mr Chuckster and his Grand Master, and to occasion the former gentleman some inconvenience from having his corns squeezed by the impatient pony. As Whisker was tired of standing, and Mr Swiveller was kind enough to stimulate him by shrill whistles and various sporting cries, they rattled off at too sharp a pace to admit of much conversation. Especially as the pony, incensed by Mr Swiveller's admonitions, took a particular fancy for the lamp-posts and cart-wheels, and evinced a strong desire to run on the pavement and rasp himself against the brick walls. It was not, therefore, until they had arrived at the stable, and the chaise had been extricated from a very small doorway, into which the pony dragged it under the impression that he could take it along with him into his usual stall, that Mr Swiveller found time to talk. 'It's hard work,' said Richard. 'What do you say to some beer?' Kit at first declined, but presently consented, and they adjourned to the neighbouring bar together. 'We'll drink our friend what's his name,' said Dick, holding up the bright frothy pot, 'that was talking to you this morning. You know. I know him. A good fellow, but eccentric. Very. Here's what's his name.' Kit pledged him. 'He lives in my house,' said Dick. 'At least